All right, the first type of tissue we're going to talk about is epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue is a tissue that lines spaces and covers organs. They have several types of functions depending on what they are and where they are, and they can be protective, so protection. They can absorb stuff, so absorption. They can secrete stuff, and they're part of filtration. So all epithelial tissues have certain characteristics. And the first one is what we call polarity. So when you hear the word polarity, think about two poles, like the North Pole and the South Pole. All epithelial tissue have two surfaces. So if we have, I don't know why my screen keeps doing this, but it's on my nerves. And I spelled epithelial wrong here. Okay, so polarity is the two surfaces that all epithelial tissues have. So if we have an epithelial tissue, so I'm just going to make a tissue here. Got cells, nuclei, and all that. Okay. So an epithelial tissue has two surfaces. The first surface is called the apical surface. So that's this surface over here. And the apical surface is the free surface. So it's the surface that's going to be in contact with like whatever's inside a hollow organ. So like your blood vessels are lined with epithelial tissue. So this side of that epithelial tissue is going to be in contact with blood. Your stomach is lined with epithelial tissue. So this apical surface in the stomach is going to touch food and whatever you're putting in your stomach. Okay, so that is the apical surface or free surface. The surface, make it green. Okay, so the surface here, this is where the epithelial tissue is attached. That is the basal surface. And the basal surface is basically connective tissue. Okay, so under here, a bit different color here. So under here we have connective tissue. So this is the basal surface. This is the part that's attached to the body. And then on the opposite side is the apical surface. Okay. The next characteristic of all epithelial tissue is that it's held together by specialized contacts. Ugh. Okay, so specialized, gosh darn it. contacts. So that means the tight junctions, desmosomes, and gap junctions that we talked about in the cell chapter. So that's how they are linked together. So remember, tight junctions hold the cells together and make them impermeable. Desmosomes hold those cells together so that they are anchored against mechanical stresses so they don't come apart. And then gap junctions allow for communication between those cells. Okay? The third thing is that all epithelial tissue is supported by connective tissue. So you can see I wrote that in here. This is connective tissue. There's basically two parts of it. So we have the basal lamina. Do that a different color just so that it, okay. So the basal lamina, which is that first little layer. And then under here, we have the reticular lamina. And those two together make the basement membrane. Okay, so this whole thing here is the basement membrane. All right. Okay, the next characteristic about all epithelial tissue is that it is avascular. So that means it has no vessels in it, no blood vessels. Okay, so if they have no blood vessels, then how do these cells survive? Well, they get all of their nutrients from the connective tissue below, because the connective tissue below is vascular. So it will have blood vessels, and the blood vessels will, these are capillaries, and blood, well, cells and things like that from the capillaries will diffuse into the epithelial tissue, giving it its nutrients. The epithelial tissue is avascular, has no vessels, so it must be connected to a connective tissue that has vessels. And it is also, though, it has nerves. So it doesn't have vessels, but it has nerves. It has receptors. Like in the skin, we've got epithelial tissue in the epidermis, and it has receptors for touch. All right, so the last characteristic is that it is very regenerative. Regenerative. Okay, so it will reproduce rapidly. Through cell division. And as long as it's getting nutrients from that connective tissue below, it will divide very rapidly if damaged. So it can replace itself very easily. All right, so in epithelial tissue, there are two types. Epithelial tissue. We have a simple epithelial tissue and a stratified epithelial tissue. Simple is just one layer of cells. Stratified is more than one layer of cells. Okay, so those are the two types of epithelial tissue. So all epithelial tissue have these characteristics. When you're looking at an epithelial tissue, you know it is an epithelial tissue if it has an apical surface and a basal surface. No other tissue type has that. So that is probably the main one, because you can't see the specialized contacts like on a slide. You can see that it is supported by connective tissue, because under that epithelial tissue where the basement membrane is, you will see connective tissue. And of course, you will not see vessels in that connective tissue either. Okay, so the next video, we're going to talk about the cells that are part of epithelial tissue and the specific tissues themselves.